Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and its tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And my name is Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed Navy videos of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that the government has admitted that UFOs are real,
Or at least that the videos were authentic.
it raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
Right? They may still be unlikely, but there's so many explanations for these stories. Even if the truth is more mundane than you're hoping, if any of it turns out to be true, whew,
Woo! It's a very exciting time. All right, Chuck, I am super excited to talk to you today. There's been a ton of UAP news. Well, kind of. There's been a lot going on in the community, not necessarily
okay.
news about UAPs.
Is
But
this like the subreddit community or like the the wider community? Like which community are you talking about here?
I mean, when I talk about the community, let's be honest, what I'm talking about is Reddit and Twitter, which is
Okay, all right,
perhaps not
cool. All right.
indicative of any larger community, but that's where I kind of pay attention to and keep abreast of what's happening
Okay.
in the UFO world. Um,
Okay, cool.
but yeah, basically, the big thing that happened this week that we're going to talk about is NASA's UAP research team,
Mm,
squad,
yeah,
task group. I am unable to
that
find out
seems
what the
exciting.
official title is. Um,
Okay.
they held their first public briefing. Um, and the community has no idea what to think about it. Like,
Okay.
yeah,
Good.
and
Yeah.
I think part of it is they didn't really understand what this briefing was, and more than that, what the task group is for. So we're going to talk about that a
Uh-huh.
little bit later. Before we
Okay.
get to that,
That's
I got a couple of news items.
okay.
So Jeremy Corbell, who is a filmmaker we've mentioned a few times before, he did that big Bob Lazar documentary, and he
Okay.
works with uh, kind of legendary journalist George Knapp, who we've talked about a lot
Okay.
before. He's based out of Las Vegas, Nevada.
Okay.
He has broken a lot of Area 51 and Bob Lazar related stories over the years.
That makes
Because
sense.
Area 51 and Bob Lazar are controversial, George Knapp is controversial, and Jeremy
Okay.
Corbell, who gives off the vibe of um, a guy who runs a martial arts studio that he made
Oh
up
no.
and does journalism in his
Okay.
spare time, um,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
because that's exactly who he is. Uh,
Okay. Great. So
he's
giving off exactly what he yeah,
Oh yeah,
I get
yeah,
it.
yeah. He gives off very particular vibes. He's fun to watch. It just I understand why people are a little he's got used car salesman
Yeah.
vibes. And George
Yeah. Yeah.
Knapp,
Yeah. Yeah.
being kind of an old school Vegas journalist, doesn't help. Um, I think the
Yeah.
two of them are largely on the right track. They're perhaps a little credulous, but they're fun. They're
Yeah.
worth paying attention to.
They make a funny superhero team though.
They really do. But they have a podcast that they started in the last few months.
Okay.
And it's been interesting. They've been breaking some news on that. And Corbell gave some comments about whistleblower testimony that I thought were pretty interesting. So he said, AARO has had over 2 dozen people come and tell them where the hardware is, meaning crashed UFOs. I know
Okay.
that as a fact because these people came to me first. I know that they're going through these classified projects. And to hear nothing about that in the hearings, it was very discouraging to the people that worked on these exploitation programs, people that know the program names, who know where the hardware is. The head of the UFO program, Dr. Kirkpatrick, said, "Oh, we don't have any conclusive evidence that any of this is extraterrestrial." So a lot of the witnesses called me after and they were like, "What the fuck?" They were like, "What is he talking about? We told him program names. We told him what we worked on." They were angry.
Mm,
Now, I've been giving you quotes every week, it seems like, from
Mhm.
some person who knows people who have testified. Um,
Yeah,
but
sure.
this one I thought was really interesting because we talked about the community's reaction to Dr. Kirkpatrick saying there's no scientific evidence of
Yeah,
extraterrestrials, and everybody kind of debating what does that mean? What does he
right.
qualify as
Yeah.
evidence? It's interesting to hear from alleged whistleblowers who allegedly have told AARO and Congress exactly where the crash retrieval programs are based out of, where the crashed
Huh.
UFOs are, to have him come out and be like, yeah, we haven't really found anything. Like, yeah,
Right.
I'd be pissed too. And he goes on to talk about for a lot of them, it's been this really demoralizing thing. These are people who,
Hmm.
by and large, are patriots. These are either military personnel
Sure.
or private contractors working in the defense industry who kind of believe they're doing the right thing, they're serving their nation.
Yeah.
And they were asked to trust the government and come forward and give testimony, and they feel like they've just been disregarded. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd be angry too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense. That is disappointing. So that was Corvell who reported that, or Knapp?
Yeah, that's a quote from Jeremy Corbell.
Okay. Why were people going to Corvell first before uh
Well, so there are only
that
so many
seems weird.
people in the UAP world who are reporting on this. So if you are an
Uh
insider with knowledge and you want to share it, at some point you got to pick someone and call their number.
okay.
Jeremy
Got
Corbell,
it.
George Knapp, Ross Coulthart, um, uh, you know, um, oh my God, UFO Daddy himself, Chris Mellon. All of these people are in contact with
Yeah.
people because they are visible, high visibility people who have
Okay.
spoken on the topic and express a willingness to believe. And we hear this from
Okay.
these people all the time, that especially if you are yourself a witness and you start speaking up about it, because there's so much stigma attached to the topic, you will
Hmm.
get people coming out of the woodwork to you like, oh my God, let me share the experience I had with you, because they're just so happy to find someone who isn't going to think they're
Mm,
crazy. And
okay.
especially
Yeah.
lately, if it seems like some journalist has some connection to the inside and might be able to
Yeah.
help you testify. Because remember, Arrow had no way to get in contact with them. They still don't.
Right.
You might be trying, just ringing random phone numbers like, hey, Jeremy, like you're on this topic. Like, can you put me in contact with someone? And we're hearing that they are
Yeah.
referring people. So I don't think it's weird
Okay.
that Jeremy Corbell has connections to people who theoretically
Okay.
testified. I can't tell you whether they're real. I can't tell you whether they
Yeah. Sure.
actually have access to crash retrieval programs. Like, are we talking about Bob Lazar?
Yeah.
Like,
Interesting.
how,
Okay.
how
Okay.
does it
Cool.
change how you feel about Jeremy Corbell saying, I know whistleblowers, if one of the whistleblowers is Bob Lazar? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's kind of personal.
Who was the New York Times the 2017 article
Yeah, that
author?
was two people. That was, oh my God. I am having so much trouble thinking of names lately. Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal.
Okay.
Yeah, they're
Cool.
they're both very good too, but they are because they work with the New York Times, they have a very high bar for
Yeah.
evidence, and they don't tend to take hearsay because they know that their editors are just going to reject it immediately if you can't get multiple corroborating
Yeah.
witnesses and stuff.
Okay. Got it. I wish we. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So another bit of news. You remember we talked about Tim McMillan, who is the co-founder of the Debrief. He broke news that Arrow does not have Title 50 authority. Um, and in a nutshell,
Right.
what that meant was they have Title 10 authority, which means they have authority to go to any military chain of command and request stuff, but they
Right.
don't explicitly have Title 50, which lets them go to intelligence community and request stuff. Now, they say this
Right.
isn't hamstringing them, but it means, on paper at least, any of these intelligence community guys could tell them to F off when they show up saying, hey, give us the
Right.
evidence you have. So Tim McMillan posted again and he said, hey, in the same vein, I found something else out. and this is another kind of wonky inside baseball thing that I don't 100% understand. So I'm going to read it
Okay.
to you the way that Tim McMillan wrote. He said, Dr.
Okay.
Sean Kirkpatrick's appointing authority is rated as highly qualified expert, an HQE, and not a general schedule or senior executive service. And of course, this is all military and government, so it's all acronyms. So he is an HQE and not, he said, you might expect one of these other ratings, GS or SES. He says HQE is a job classification that is unique to the DoD and is used for subject matter experts and consultants. It is rare, but not unheard of, for an HQE to lead a program office, in particular because they lack the bureaucratic muscle to make anyone snap to attention. He says, now,
Mm.
conversely, the group that came before AARO was stood up, the UAP task force, was led by Jay Stratton. They had both Title 50 and Title 10 authorities, and they were led by an SES2. And he said, I want to stress none of this speaks to Dr. Kirkpatrick's competency or ability to do the job, but rather I find it notable that AARO was stood up with considerably less administrative power than the UAP task force. And yeah, like we talked a few episodes ago, like, is AARO being set up to fail? And I don't like to slide
Yeah.
into conspiracy thinking, like it's pretty easy to do that. But when you look at something like this, like there was an existing group in the Pentagon dedicated to doing UAP research, and they had
Right.
certain authorities and abilities and ratings. And then they stood up a new group when they were mandated to by Congress, a group that sidesteps a problematic chain of command, a group that reports directly to Congress. And all of a sudden, that new one doesn't have those same authorities. That sure does look weird. That it's hard for me to think of a reason why that would happen outside of sabotage, but who knows? I'm not a military insider. Maybe this is
Yeah.
completely common.
Yeah. That's interesting. Like looking at some of the people who are, or the roles that are SES2 is
Mhm,
like Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of
mhm,
Army, um, some of the deputive deputy secretaries.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, yeah, that is really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that kind of, yeah, points at that idea of just being understaffed or
Mhm.
under credentialed. Um,
Yeah. Like it
is
feels.
is
Sorry, go ahead.
HQE even a is that even a like pay title or
I have no idea. I just read to you all the information I know about this. So,
okay, I got it.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think what it looks to me like is not necessarily overt sabotage so much as when they were running their own program, they gave the guy the authority to do anything. When they were told by Congress to run a program in a certain way, this feels like a territoriality thing. Like, okay, I'll do the thing you told me to do and nothing more. I'm going to do the bare fucking minimum to get you off my neck, and I'm not going to report to you. I don't really care. It feels petulant to me more than like mustache twirling villain sabotage. It feels like, fuck you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something like I think I remember asking about that earlier. Like Sean Kirkpatrick, like I kind of wondered aloud whether he was put in place. Uh, like he didn't have a lot of the background that I
Yeah,
would expect for running a
agreed.
program,
Agreed.
and even I could tell that as not a like
Hmm.
government expert. So it seemed very suspicious
Hmm.
that the program would be run that way. And so yeah,
Hmm.
maybe this guy is right in supposing
Yeah.
that
And when you
this really
combine it
was
with
set
like,
up as a scapegoat.
yeah, and when you combine that with like they still haven't appointed a deputy director who does the intelligence
Yeah.
community side, they haven't addressed any of the authorities. They haven't fixed the chain of command stuff. Like all of this feels very sketchy. But anyway,
Yeah. But then why did Sean Kirkpatrick not say, like, not rise to the Gillibrand challenge of like, are they giving you what you need?
well, I think we spoke about this at the time, and my take on that is he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. Like, let's assume for the moment that he is on the side of Kristen Gillibrand and he wants this to succeed and he is invested in its success. Kristen Gillibrand is not his boss, right? The the
Yeah.
SecDef and other people under his chain of command are. And if he goes mouthing off to Congress about how he's not getting what he wants from his boss, like, I mean, you've had bosses before, right? How would they take it if you went to a different VP in a different department and started talking about how your boss wasn't giving you what you need? Whether it's true or not, I don't think you would expect a warm reception the next time you had to see your boss.
I don't know. I feel like there's ways to do it. And I only say that because I frequently do that with my current boss. But uh,
You are perhaps not
so,
the
I don't
not the
know.
person to talk to about the
Yeah, I
sensitivity
suppose
around the chain of command.
it's true. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's probably right.
All right. Well, moving on to our next item. So Avi Loeb. We've talked about Avi Loeb a little bit. He is a Harvard astronomer. He is the head of the Galileo Project, which is a civilian research group aimed at setting up uh, sky surveying equipment around the world to try to look for evidence of UAP. Um, if you've heard of him before, it is probably because he was the guy who was saying that Oumuamua, the weird asteroid maybe object that flew through the solar system a few years ago, he was arguing that it was of extraterrestrial origin, or at least could be, which is obviously a somewhat controversial stance to take. Um,
Right, yeah.
so he's a big character. He's really interesting to listen to. But he has had a very particular viewpoint the whole time, which basically boils down to why is everyone afraid to look at it through this lens? He's like, I'm not saying it's alien, but I'm saying there are traits here that could be interpreted as alien. And as a
Mhm.
scientist, it's our job to interpret the data, not to jump to a conclusion. So what we need is more evidence. The next time an
Yeah.
object like Oumuamua comes through the system, we need to be prepared to go out and investigate it and find out what it is. Um, and the
Mm.
Galileo Project, he's approaching the same way. He's like, I'm not telling you there are UFOs flying around, but what I am telling you is if the only data that anyone has on this is military and it's classified, we're never going to find out. So the way we
Yeah.
solve this is, hey, I'm an astronomer. Let's go set up infrared telescopes and sky cams
Mm.
and recording equipment
Hell yeah.
at various UAP hotspots around the world. Um, so
The military is gonna love that.
yeah, yeah. So Avi's a really interesting guy. I really like him. He put up an article around the time of the NASA press conference that we'll talk about in a second.
Okay.
Uh, the title is NASA, AARO, and the Galileo Project agree on the need for a scientific study of UAP. Now, there's a little bit of
Okay.
an undercurrent to this article that I'm not really going to address, where he seems to be kind of preemptively addressing people who are like, okay, well, hold on. If NASA's looking at this, why do we need the Galileo Project? And if
Mhm.
AARO's looking at this, why do we need NASA to look at it? Like, why do we have these
Right.
three competing efforts? And his
Right.
kind of through line is, well, we're all in different domains, but it boils down
Yeah.
to all three of us are saying there is insufficient data and we need to gather more data.
Yeah.
So,
Erica, uh, my sweetie, when she was going to get her master's in public administration, she noticed that there were a lot of like repeat nonprofits and that seemed to have the same mission, and often wondered aloud why this continued happening. And I think you're right that um, they're just different domains, and
Mhm.
sometimes it is repeated, sometimes it is wasteful,
Sure.
but sometimes even if the mission looks exactly the same, there may be more to it than
Mhm.
mission and vision. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So the reason I want to talk about this article is not really that, because mostly I think Avi has a tendency to come out a little defensive. Like, I think he gets a lot
Mm,
of flack from his peers. Like, why are you so weird about aliens, Avi?
yeah.
So he tends to strike a little bit of a defensive tone. But he gave some really interesting information in this article that I didn't know around the kind of
Okay.
timeline and how the Galileo project got set up. So he said,
Nice.
on June 4th, 2021, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson said in an interview on CNN that scientists should study the nature of UAP. Um, Now, I have not been
Okay.
coming to you with a lot of NASA quotes about UAP. The reason is whenever I hear someone from NASA talk about this, it it feels like they're kind of winking and nodding at the topic without
Mm,
really taking it
yeah.
seriously. Like, oh yeah, there could be extraterrestrials out there. But if you actually ask them about it, they almost universally boil down to it is mathematically almost certain that intelligent life exists somewhere out there.
Yeah.
It is, according to how we understand physics today, almost impossible that they would have come to visit us. That seems to be kind of
Right.
the party line among
Yeah.
serious astronomers and astrophysicists, which
Yeah.
I don't blame them for having, but it can kind of like shut the conversation down ahead of time if they're like, there's no way this could happen. Um,
Sure. Yeah. But
so when
it's
Bill
still
Nelson
phenomena.
Yeah, so when Bill Nelson gives this quote that, oh yeah, scientists should study UAP, I didn't hear that as UAP are real and legitimate and we need to study them. I
No.
heard them as there is no reason a scientist should not look at it, which is itself kind of a
Right.
groundbreaking statement, but compared to like New York Times articles talking about crash retrieval programs, it's not as exciting, right? So I tend to kind
Yeah.
of let those quotes slide.
Got
So
it.
Avi says the very next day, he emails Dr. Thomas Zurbuchen, and I probably butchered that name. Sorry if you're listening, doctor. Uh, NASA's associate administrator at the time for science about possible funding of a scientific research program that would make his boss happy.
Mm,
First of all, Avi, love the hustle. Nice work.
yeah.
Uh, right? Like, hey, I just saw your boss in the news saying he wants to study UAP, and I happen to have a thing here. You can throw
I
some
have some
money at
ideas.
it, right? So he says he got a very polite reply from the
Uh-huh.
doctor who asked for a white paper with more information, which Avi sent immediately, which tells you
Mm-hmm.
that Avi had kind of been building up to this idea for a while.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
he said the doctor never answered him. And
Yeah.
fast forward to 2 months later, Avi established the Galileo Project at Harvard. It has
Mm.
now received over $5 million dollars in funding exclusively
Well,
via private donations. So
okay.
this is something I always want to kind of clarify. The Galileo project is based out of Harvard, but it is not like a Harvard program. Like Harvard isn't paying
Okay.
for it. They're just at Harvard, and private individuals are funding the science.
So, but in some ways, Harvard uh, is lending credence and lending
Credibility.
meeting
Yeah,
rooms and stuff like that.
sure,
Yeah,
sure.
not credence, credibility. And they're definitely allowing the use of facilities,
Mhm.
maybe allowing the use of equipment. So they're definitely like it's a tier of support.
Yeah, there's room for an extended conversation about this, and one of these days we'll talk about John Mack, who was
Okay.
a actually he might have been at Harvard too, but he was a psychiatrist who was studying abductees, and
Hmm.
basically they tried to kick him out because he was
Hmm.
sullying the name of Harvard. And it kind of
Right.
raises the same question of what does an employee of the university who is doing science somewhat independently of the university owe to the university? Anyway,
Yeah. I mean,
um,
yeah, but like you say, if they haven't kicked him out yet, that
Yeah.
is a degree of support. So
Totally. Yeah, 100%. So anyway, a few months later, Avi establishes the Galileo Project. 2 years later, which is now like a few weeks ago,
okay.
they published 8 peer-reviewed papers about the
Oh,
construction of their first operating UAP observatory at Harvard, which is
okay.
monitoring the entire sky using infrared, optical, radio, and audio at all times. Um,
Nice.
he doesn't get into the weeds too much, but he says the data
Mhm.
stream is analyzed by AI using machine learning to classify known objects to help with their search for anomalous ones, which I think is a really
Okay.
smart way to do it, right? Record the whole
Yeah.
sky, cut out everything that moves that you can clearly identify. That leaves you with a smaller data set of weird
Yeah.
things to look
Right.
at. So at the moment, they have one research platform, which is located at Harvard, which is
Okay.
notably not a UAP hotspot. Um,
Right. Yeah. Of
and
course.
Avi has given interviews about this, that the goal is to set them up elsewhere, but he wanted to set the first
Yeah.
one up at Harvard so that they could validate the equipment, validate the data
Yeah.
collection, just make sure the platform is operating. And then it's about replicating that platform in other locations where you
Yep.
would be more likely to spot something. Um,
Yeah. Totally.
he said last week he was contacted by donors interested in funding 5 copies of the observatory. That is really interesting and big news because I've listened to a lot of
Yeah.
interviews with Avi, and it was clear that funding was always a problem. Like the kind of telescopes and instrumentation that they need is not super cheap. So when they say they got $5 million,
Yeah.
as I understand it, that $5 million basically covered the Harvard platform, setting up the machine learning platform, and paying for a few research assistants to work on it. Like it does
Sure.
not cover any more. So having someone
Yeah.
come and say, we're going to fund 5 more copies of it, he doesn't have a dollar figure attached to
Pretty
it, but you
great.
can guess it's pretty significant. And he's been strongly searching for funding for a while now,
Hmm.
appearing on podcasts and saying, look, if you are an individual with deep pockets who cares about this topic, like reach out to me. Like there's room for you to contribute here.
The title of this being like, we can go to the Stars Academy.
Oh, so yeah, the last quote I want to include is Avi talked about this a little bit. He said the advantage of collecting new data with well-calibrated instruments that are fully characterized, rather than relying on past anecdotal reports from uncalibrated sensors, is that we can study anomalies systematically relative to the background of known objects and aim to gather exquisite data that will resolve their nature. Claims for new physics can only be substantiated by exceptional data that cannot be interpreted otherwise. They should not be believed based on eyewitness testimonies or events that took place decades ago with compromised or classified quality. Now, that quote is a big deal, not because Avi Loeb thinks it, but because Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick believes the same thing. And we know this because he has spent some time hanging out with Avi Loeb. They published an article together, and we're hearing Sean Kirkpatrick parrot a lot of this language. So, my impression of this is Dr. Kirkpatrick is himself a scientist. He's coming
Yeah.
into a high attention paid to him field with
Yeah.
perhaps conflicting goals among multiple people that he reports to. And I
Mm.
100% understand why someone in that position would fall back on hard science is the way to go. Nobody can get
Yeah.
mad at me for saying we need data and
Yeah.
to interpret data. But that
Yeah.
last bit, especially about uncalibrated equipment,
Yeah.
unreliable eyewitness testimony, events that took place decades ago. I think that speaks to Sean's statement of we have no
Right.
evidence of extraterrestrial activity when people are like, what about the Nimitz? What about this? What about that? What about all these things that you do have information on?
Right.
They're saying
Yeah.
the military sensors that we're relying on are not calibrated for detecting things like UAP. They are calibrated for detecting things like missiles and jets
Yeah.
and like
Right.
military threats that they know about, it is understandable that perhaps the data they gather is not optimized for what we want to do, which is look at that weird thing over there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
we may not even be able to, like the calibration may be
mhm,
classified as well.
100%.
Um, so yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And if that's what Sean Kirkpatrick is thinking,
Mhm,
that you're right, that is a huge deal.
yeah. Now I will say that personally, I'm with Dr. Gary Nolan on this. Eyewitness testimony is data, and disregarding it because
Yeah.
it doesn't cleanly fit your desire for, you know, clean, reproducible mechanical data is a little bit bullshit. Like I do think that's a
Yeah.
bit disingenuous to pretend like all this other information can just be ignored because it's not perfect according to this new system that I just made up. Like, but for someone like Avi Loeb, whose goal is to create a new data gathering platform, I think that's a reasonable stance to take. He's explaining why is this valuable? If we already have military recordings, if we already have information out there, why should some rich investor pay me to set up a telescope in Brazil or wherever that to possibly record UFOs? Here's
Yeah.
why. Because I will be able to get unambiguous, clean data out of this that is not something that other people could potentially dismiss, like eyewitness data. I don't agree with it, but I understand why someone from a hard science background who is maybe worried about catching some flack from other people would land on this viewpoint.
Yeah. Um, so just to, I want to rewind just a brief moment. Talking about the price of these instruments,
Yeah.
I had this like question in my mind about whether this was something that they were going to crowdsource
Mm-hmm.
that like I could put on my roof or something.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of their articles, they have a drawing of
Mm-hmm.
what the current setup looks like,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like it has two devices that are about 6-ish foot tall. Then it
Mm-hmm.
has three more that are about 12 foot tall, and a last one that's probably 15 to 18 foot tall,
Right.
all over like 100-foot span. So
Mm-hmm.
like I don't know, it just gives it just from the raw material cost.
No, totally, right? This is not
It's
an
like this is like
off-the-shelf telescope that you're pointing at the sky.
yeah,
This is high
right.
caliber material. Yeah.
This is really intense. So
Hmm.
I just didn't have a feeling for that. So
Hmm.
apologies for the wild um, departure, but yeah,
No, no.
it
I
makes
think it's
sense why
valuable to
they.
point out. Yeah.
Yeah, so it makes sense what they're saying. Like, yeah, the instruments that are observing things, they are probably very well calibrated, but there may be things that we don't get to know about, or they may not be
Hmm.
built for science, and also they're going to be on often mobile platforms, which
Hmm. Hmm.
introduces a lot of change too. So
Yeah.
this makes a lot of sense, but also, yeah, this is going to be freaking expensive.
Yep. Yep.
It's really interesting.
It's interesting that you talk about mobile platforms as being a problem. We're going to talk about this a
Oh
little
yeah.
later. One of the three videos that came out in the New York Times from To
Hmm.
the Stars Academy back in 2017 was called the Go Fast video. And
Hmm.
more than any of the other videos, the community has spent a lot of time trying to
Hmm.
figure this one out. There's a very prominent skeptic named Mick West who spent a while trying to argue that this was like a lens flare or something like that, so
Uh-huh.
that other military witnesses who knew how to read this data had to come out and say, like, no, you're misunderstanding. Here's what this means. Here's what this means. So more than the other videos, this one has been thoroughly dissected. And the community has
Hmm.
landed on the idea that this thing is moving, I think they said something like 150 miles an hour, which isn't crazy fast for like a jet or
No.
something, but like, it's not drifting with the wind.
Yeah.
We'll
Right.
talk about this in a minute, but one of the guys on the NASA panel, uh, pulled up the video, and without knowing any of the background around it or any of the community engagement or any of the endless discussion that's already happened, he's like, I did a bit of simple trigonometry on it. The thing's going like 40 miles an hour. And everybody's just ripped him apart. Like, you're not
Yeah.
factoring in the wind. You're not thinking about this 3D model that we made. You're like, oh, this
Oh
poor
my
guy
God.
stepped right into a
Yeah.
minefield. But I think
Yeah.
it speaks to the difficulty of this is a video recorded from a jet that is moving relative to another object that is moving, and the background
Yeah.
is like clouds. Like, you know,
Yeah.
there's
That's a
room for
mess.
intelligent people to disagree about how to interpret even this kind of straightforward video.
Oh yeah, totally. That's an absolute mess. It's going to be
Yeah.
really difficult to deal with. Yeah.
All right. So, speaking of the NASA panel, let's talk about it real fast.
Okay. I'm
So
excited.
on May 31st, the NASA UAP Study Panel, which, by the way, has a report due out in July, held
Okay.
their
Oh,
first
that's
public briefing to review the work that it's done over the last year. Um, the kind of high level summary of what they said is we need more data. Like, if
sure.
there's one thing you can say that the clear message from NASA was, is we need more data. So
Yeah.
now you understand why Avi Loeb kind of jumped in early on with like, hey, we all agree we need more data. See, told you guys, hey,
Yeah.
conveniently, I have a
Yep.
platform I'm setting up. We can all work together.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this team for a second, because I think it's
Okay.
not what a lot of people think. When you hear NASA UAP Study Panel, I think it would be reasonable to assume these are NASA scientists. They are not. It is
Yeah.
an
Okay.
independent commission of external people put together by NASA. Now, that said, many of the people are former NASA employees. One of the Kelly brothers is on it. Bunch of former NASA scientists, but also like independent scientists. This is a team of 16 researchers with backgrounds in astrophysics, oceanography, astronomy, and other fields. They have focused on identifying data that can potentially be analyzed to learn more about UAP. The 9-month study focused on unclassified data and considered what information can be gathered from civilian government entities and the private sector. Um, and I'm going to read one more quote on this line. Early on, one of the heads of the group said, the goal of the panel is to give NASA guidelines on how to contribute to the understanding of the nature of UAP. So they're not doing the research. They're telling NASA, how do you go about doing research into UAP?
Oh. Okay.
The defense data is classified because of the desire not to reveal the technical capabilities of its sensors, but NASA's data is open. However, the current
Yeah.
approach is unsystematic, often using instruments that are uncalibrated and poorly characterized. To understand UAP better, thorough data collection and rigorous analysis is needed.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
not that
Okay.
surprising given the context we just talked about with
Yeah.
Avi and everything, but I think we're seeing a pretty clear through line here. These are the people who were put together by NASA to tell NASA, how do we even go about studying UAP, right? In theory,
Right.
we are a civilian agency with no classified data. We have collection platforms. We are, if any government agency if any agency is set up to do research into UAP, it should be NASA. What do you recommend we do? And they basically came back with the same thing as the Galileo Project. You need a clear process, you need
Yeah.
better equipment, and you need a uh, a better understanding of what you are looking at once you get the data.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. So I found another reference in one of their docs that talked about having observatory grade, portable, and mesh grade uh,
Hmm.
sensors, and they said the observatory grade was like 250K.
Yeah.
Um, but the mesh grade, which maybe could be distributed to individuals,
Mhm, mhm.
they were thinking is somewhere around 2.5K. Like,
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Really interesting. So I like that they're thinking about the different like sizes in like because I think NASA does a lot of that with like weather systems. They'll have like a few really good systems that they know are really well calibrated, from which they can kind of ground truth other
Mm,
nearby systems and say like, hey, this is way out of spec for what we have at the
mm,
airport.
yeah.
Uh, Maybe this one is not as high quality, or maybe needs
Mm.
some love. So that's really cool that they're yeah, okay. So it's surprising that they didn't latch on to this like white paper. I wonder, or
Well,
maybe that.
Avi did throw them a little shade in his article. He
Yeah,
talked about, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. They came back
sure,
and
yeah,
they're saying all these things that I said in my white paper 2 years ago. But hey, it's all
yeah,
good. We can all do the research.
yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe not answering a white paper is maybe they're just stuck in discussions or something, or maybe that wasn't their job.
Yeah.
If you're saying like this commission's purpose was to come up with the white paper that Avi already wrote, like, well,
Yeah.
we're getting paid, so
Yeah. Yeah. Well, although that's an interesting point also. Now, I didn't mention this earlier because I wasn't able to find the source information, but one of the things I saw people repeating was that the entire budget for this UAP study group was 125K
okay.
for a 9-month study involving 16 individuals. I mean, that doesn't
Oof.
cover salary. These people are not working full time. We're meeting a
No,
few
yeah.
times over 9 months and making some phone calls. Like,
Yeah, 19 you said?
Uh,
Oh, it's like
sorry, 16 researchers over 9 months.
16. God, it's like
That's
lunch
nothing.
budget.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, but again, like you said, if the goal is the output is a white paper, it doesn't
Yeah,
sound as crazy. But I think this is part of why the community was so confused and kind of
yeah,
weirded out about this. Like these guys
yeah.
met and they're asking all these really basic questions, like they're just coming to this and have done no research. Like, well, yeah,
Well,
they
that's kind
haven't.
of true. Yeah.
So yeah, in the panel they went on. This was like a 4-hour discussion. Um, but one of the things they talked about is that some of the scientists in the group said they were experiencing harassment.
Hmm.
Um, Now, this statement caused a bit of controversy on Reddit. Reddit, of course, never thinks they're harassing anyone. We're just asking questions. Uh, but I think they had a fair point, which is it felt to Reddit like some of the scientists on this group came in predisposed against the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Okay.
And when they made statements to that effect, and Redditors pointed out, frankly, this should be cause for firing in a group dedicated to studying UAP, that you have already predetermined that one outcome is not going to happen.
Unacceptable.
Uh, is that harassment or is that being held to account?
Hmm.
I don't know. Like I wasn't there. I don't know what they mean when they
Yeah.
say they were harassed. They were clear that they were getting harassment from both skeptics and believers, which I totally believe.
I
The
completely.
impression I got was that a lot of this was, hey, these are serious scientists, and some of their colleagues were not super pleased that they were taking the topic seriously, which
Yeah.
boils down to a point that they made repeatedly, that Sean Kirkpatrick has made repeatedly at AARO, that everyone in the field has made across the board, which is the number one thing we need to do is reduce the stigma around
Yeah.
this topic. Because right now, what you get, the instant it comes up, is an emotional knee jerk response based on the
Yeah.
cultural stew that we all live
Yep.
in, of what UAP means and UFOs and the X Files theme and little green men and
Yep.
giggling. And like, you have to be able to step past that. We're not going to be able to do that unless we start taking it seriously. So,
Yeah.
it sucks that they're experiencing harassment, but it does speak to the larger problem of we have to reduce the stigma about looking at this topic seriously at all. Because
Yeah.
if the one thing has become clear, It's that there's something to look at. We can disagree
Yeah,
about what it is, but there's something to look at.
something there. Yeah, like even so, just thinking about my journey. When we repeat our like intro every morning, I feel a little bit more ridiculous every single time we record it, even though
Yeah.
we throw it away, because it is very clearly like written from the perspective of a complete non-believer. And
Oh, yeah,
now
yeah, yeah.
when I read my words, I'm like, oh, this
You're
doesn't feel like.
specifically referring to the parts about you where we
Yes,
describe
yeah,
you
the
as
parts I'm
we don't
saying.
use the word skeptic, but we say tolerant.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because I feel like even I have learned and come very far
Mhm.
in my like thoughts about what could be here. But one
Mhm.
thing I think that is important for the scientists is that so the question of should they be thrown out for having preconceived notions? I don't think so. And I think
Mhm.
that the act of being forced to look critically at these things and to look into the actual information is an important step along the way of getting rid of stigma. Now, these 16 people are a little more likely to actually read the New York Times article if it comes out, you know?
I agree with you with one condition. What you're saying is based on the idea that they're willing to change their mind. And I
Well,
think what
sure,
Reddit is
yeah,
reacting to is the idea that they've already made up their mind and are not willing to change it. And
yeah.
to be fair, there has been a lot of this over the years. The Condon Report, which famously closed out Air Force research into
Mm,
UFOs back in the 60s, in 1969, I think it was, it came out. So this is the end of Project Blue Book. Before, this was an official Air Force department. After, the Air Force's statement is based on the Condon Report, we will no longer investigate this. The Condon, the guy who set up the report, was recorded multiple times telling people this is a bunch of bullshit. There's nothing here. We are going to find that they should not look into it. And they hadn't done the
yeah,
work yet. And then, in
yeah.
fact, if you read the report, it does
That's what they
not
said.
conclude that there's
No.
nothing to it. It goes out of their way to say,
Okay.
like, yeah, there are anomalous cases and they are weird. They're rare, but they do exist. And then
Yeah.
Condon wrote the preface that said, there's nothing to this. So
Interesting. Okay.
I totally get what you're saying. And yes, absolutely. If they are true scientists, they may already have an opinion, but if they're coming in with an open mind, 100% agree. They should be free to
Sure.
come in and learn more about it as long as they are willing to revisit their opinion.
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
what the community is worried about is any perception of a repeat of the Condon report of, some
Hmm.
scientist with an axe to grind coming in predisposed to think this is nonsense and
Yeah.
unwilling to take it seriously or look at it. In that
Yeah.
context, I agree that that would be kind of a you're not qualified to be on this research panel kind of
100%
situation.
agree there. Yeah. But yeah, so you're right. I think open-mindedness has to be the hiring requirement rather than
Mhm.
in fact, I would prefer someone be a disbeliever but open-minded than
Totally.
someone who's fanatically already there because that's as bad too.
100%. Absolutely. Yeah, the opposite extreme is just as problematic. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
It gets back to the thing we keep quoting Gary Nolan as saying, which is like, if you're coming in with your mind already made up, you have no right to call yourself a scientist because you're not doing
Yeah.
science. Science is
Yeah.
about exploring the data and
Yeah.
trying to come to a conclusion and following where it goes. But if you're coming in saying this is it or this isn't it, you're not doing science and you shouldn't call yourself a scientist.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. And as you said, it applies on both sides. If you're coming in saying this is absolutely aliens, that's just as bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So yeah, they talked about harassment a little bit. Um, Kirkpatrick dropped out one little subtle dig at the public. Remember in the previous interview, he said science isn't done by social media posts, and he encouraged people to kind of like give his team space. Like, all right, that was a pretty good dig, Sean. He said he and his team at Arrow have also been harassed. He said, my team and I have also been subjected to lots of harassment, especially coming out of my last Senate hearing. because people don't understand the scientific method.
Mm. I mean, that is really true.
It is true, but also I don't think that's the big reason you're getting harassed, Sean.
Yeah.
So yeah, as I just mentioned, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick was there. Part of the briefing was to allow the NASA people to ask Sean Kirkpatrick questions. I'm not going to talk too much about what he said because it was pretty much a rehash of what he said to Senator Gillibrand last month, but there were a few updates in there. He shared that AARO now has over 800 cases. Last time it
Hmm.
was 600 something.
Yeah.
He said they're getting 50 to 100 new reports every month. And this most recent increase to 800 includes a trove of over 100 that were recently acquired from the FAA. So
Okay.
that's encouraging because
Yeah.
that shows the thing we were all worried about, which is he is continuing to reach out to other agencies and get their historical data and incorporate
Yeah.
it into his data set. Um, and he again tried to downplay the total amount that are anomalous. He said 2 to 5% of the total data set are possibly really anomalous. Um, it's hard to know what
Huh.
he's basing that on. Again, he gave us a little bit of insight into his workflow last time. But I will say that tracks with what I have heard from people like Ross Coulthart and Chris Mellon over the years, which is most UAP reports are explainable.
Oh, yeah.
And people tend to land on this idea of if something like 5% of them are genuinely strange, that's still enough to look into. So, it's
Yeah.
tempting as a human to think if 95% of something is bullshit,
It must be.
maybe we
Yeah.
don't care about the last 5%. But that's not actually how statistics work.
Yeah, right. Do you have a feeling of how much italicizing was on that word really? Like, was it 2 to 5% was really anomalous, or 2 to 5% was really anonymous? Like that, I don't know. That's
No, so I'll be honest with you. I didn't actually watch the hearing. It was 4 hours long. I read
yeah,
4 or 5 different recaps of it. But the quote is possibly really anomalous. So to me, that says the emphasis is on he's saying genuinely anomalous,
genuinely
not
anonymous.
extremely anomalous.
Okay, because that would be so much more fun if it was the
Yeah.
latter. Okay.
Um, he was asked if anything they've analyzed could indicate extraterrestrial. He said, "Oh no, I'm sorry. This was the NASA people were asked this. Uh, if anything they'd analyzed indicated ET, and they were very quick to say we cannot make that kind of extraordinary claim for any big subject in science.
Yeah.
The role of this panel has been to create a roadmap and a framework for how all scientists who are interested in this phenomena can further study it. So I feel like the scientists were like, whoa, 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 don't pin
Whoa.
this on us.
Yeah.
We're just saying how you would do the research. We haven't done it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Kirkpatrick shared another video, which I'm not going to talk to you about because it was another one where he immediately debunked it. In this case, it was a video of 3 lights moving across the sky, but it turned out to just be much further away than it looked at first
Hmm.
glance, and it was a commercial aircraft going to a major airport. He
Makes sense.
shares these stories as a way to indicate the difficulty of even trained observers to identify these things and also to kind of illustrate the kind of stuff that's in his data set, right? It's not all stuff like the Nimitz.
Yeah.
It's also like a pilot saw something weird and, you know,
Yeah.
so he talked last time about them doing this kind of initial triage of sort them
Hmm.
into likely buckets. Okay, these ones
Yeah.
sound like they behave like a balloon. We're not super interested in those. These ones are breaking the sound barrier and behaving in ways we don't understand. Those should go over into the pay attention to bucket.
Yeah. Right.
So, I'm not thrilled that every time Kirkpatrick appears in public, he throws up another video that is not real. It it smacks of the tactics that debunkers have used for years, which is basically trying to,
Yeah.
if the only things you see are garbage, it's human nature could conclude that it's all garbage.
Right.
And that there's still those 2 to 5% that are genuinely anomalous. And I
Yeah.
wish he would talk about some of those as well. Now, last
Yeah.
time he shared the video of the weird metallic orb that was captured by a drone.
Yeah.
Uh, he went into that a little bit more this time. He
Okay.
said, and this was the quote that got repeated in big name newspapers like The Hill and Politico and stuff. He said, U.S. military personnel are observing metallic orbs all over the world, making interesting apparent maneuvers. Um, he shared the same slide as last time with the kind of breakdown of,
Yeah.
what they tend to observe. But he talked a little bit more about the metal spheres. He said they tend to be small, 3 to 13 feet in diameter, spherical objects capable of flight at a range of velocities from stationary to twice the speed of sound, despite a
Mm.
perplexing absence of thermal exhaust, such as heat from an engine. Of particular note, Kirkpatrick made clear, some of these highly anomalous characteristics are observed via multiple sensors.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, you were wanting more undebunked things. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty big.
It's pretty big, and people are talking about it, which I do appreciate. I already mentioned one of the NASA guys pulled up the Go Fast video, and he said he had done some basic trigonometry.
Uh-huh.
People ripped him apart. The
Yeah.
thing I think is funniest about this is enough people were criticizing this particular thing that NASA had to walk it back. They spoke to the Liberation Times and officially released a statement. NASA has not taken an official position on the origin of the Go Fast video. And this was something else that the community kind of latched onto, they confirmed that team members did not have access to raw sensor data and
Mm.
have not spoken to any of the pilots. So
Uh-huh.
they were kind of like, hey, listen, these aren't NASA people. This is an external team. They don't have access to anything. They just watched the YouTube video, same as you. We haven't said anything about Go Fast. Please stop calling us.
Yeah. 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 I love that.
Um, the last thing I'll say about the metal spheres, because I
Yeah.
think people sometimes get hung up on, right? Like Mick West loves to look at these videos and spend a lot of time talking about how fast they were going and everything like that, while kind of ignoring the other things that are anomalous about it. So,
Mm.
um, an opinion writer on the Hill, Merrick von Rennenkampf, noted, to be sure, rigorous scientific analysis may ultimately identify a prosaic explanation for such observations. In the meantime, however, such metallic orbs are prima facie evidence of extraordinary technology. After all, how would spheres, lacking wings or apparent forms of propulsion, execute maneuvers of any kind? The point is not how fast they're doing the maneuvers. The point is that they are maneuvering. That's like they turned against the wind. They moved against the wind. They were stationary against the wind. All of these are things that we don't know how a metal sphere would do. We could conceivably come up with how to make a metal sphere a lifting body, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
for one thing, you could fill it full of vacuum. It'll go
Mm-hmm.
up, but it's not going to maneuver. It's not going to do things. Like, you have to add other things. So when you combine
Yeah.
no thermal exhaust with the maneuvers, like, okay, sure, maybe it wasn't going quite as fast as it looks in the video, but it's doing something. Can we talk about that, please?
Yeah. Yeah. I do think it's worth, like, I really think we need calibrated instruments. It feels to me like one of those like uh, propellers bending because
Yeah.
of shutter
Hmm.
lag or whatever the term is.
Totally.
And it's like it feels like the kind of thing that could be a reasonable artifact of a very high
Hmm.
quality sensor. Um,
Yeah.
and I would love to dig into that and see
Hmm.
if it's really true.
No, totally. We talked about this last time. The drone video of the metallic orb over Afghanistan.
Yeah,
Um, in the video, it looks like it's moving along at quite a clip. Um, but parallax is a thing. The
yeah,
drone is moving forward, the ground is moving at a certain rate. The sphere appears to be moving faster,
right,
but that could also just be as you're flying over the sphere and it's closer to you, it moves
right.
past the frame of the camera relatively, so
Yeah,
100% agree. Better collection addresses this. And, it speaks to ultimately the conclusion that the group is making, and we expect to read in their uh, July reissue of Avi Loeb's white paper.
yeah,
That, yeah, the ultimate answer is we need more and better data, and we need to be
yeah,
serious about how we're collecting it. This kind
yeah,
of haphazard when we think of it, oh, something weird happened, somebody go grab the data. Like, no, there needs to be processes and procedures and standards in place. And um, Kirkpatrick is doing that on the DoD side. He's talking about working with military and intelligence groups to establish standard collecting procedures and norms around how you retain this data and make reports. And it sounds like NASA is kind of coming at this from the civilian side of we need the same thing here for commercial pilots and astronauts and satellites and how do we go about establishing this? And Avi Loeb is saying let's cut the pilots out of it altogether. Like we just need more observation platforms. So I think it's really interesting that they're all kind of coming to the same place, which is there's something here that's worth researching. And if we're going to research it and take it seriously, we need better quality data.
yeah. I'm finding myself thinking about like, um, it's sort of a shame that that we can't uh, give this to the military, who is already observing these like metallic
Hmm.
orbs, but they just don't have the same incentive. Um, but if Galileo was providing these instruments and making sure they're still calibrated, and the military only has to roll them out into the field, um,
Hmm.
and then they can ground truth their sensors against it, they
Hmm.
wouldn't have to hide anything. They wouldn't have
Right.
to like classify any information or blur out any of the videos because, like, it's uh, we know exactly what those instruments were. They're open source or whatever.
Absolutely. No, and you make a really excellent point too, right? Like you talked about how expensive the things in the Galileo project observation platforms are, but at the end of the day, they are all off the shelf. They may be
Yeah,
very expensive, hard to get, but they are not military platforms. They are not classified
right.
platforms. These are things that are understood and commercially available. And the military's main excuse for why they don't release any footage of anything is the
It
means
is
of
classified.
collecting it itself is classified. And I'm sympathetic to that, but
Yeah,
I totally agree with you that the Galileo project and, commercial satellites and NASA observation platforms may be the way to work around this. Like, all right, like clearly we can't wait for the military to decide to share what they have. So let's
yeah,
do it ourselves.
yeah, yeah. And maybe eventually the military can be a delivery platform rather than the
Sure.
actual. But it would be nice if we could get some incentive alignment. If there was some reason the military wanted Galileo
Hmm.
to ground truth their
Yeah.
sensors or something like that, then
Hmm.
I don't know, might see some good investment there. Anyways,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, and it also brings us back to something we've been talking about for a long time too, which is, um, and even Sean Kirkpatrick talked about it in his slide about like where do we see these things? Well, hey, guess what? We see them around military sites.
yeah,
Like, is that because they're really interested in our military sites, or is it because these are the most heavily surveilled places on the planet? Um, we can answer that by putting more sensor platforms in other places, like
yeah,
you know.
right,
Um, and yeah, I totally agree with you that it would be great if, you know, like maybe Avi Loeb sets a few of these out in Nevada or Utah and some of those hot spots like Skinwalker Ranch,
Right.
but maybe also the military puts some out at some of the Air Force bases where they're keeping the nukes, you know?
Yeah, right. And then they could actually look at they could make sure that
Mhm.
nothing was observed that they didn't want
Yeah,
observed, but
yeah,
otherwise release it or whatever. Because otherwise someone's going to do it for them, and they aren't going to
yeah,
be happy with that. But
yeah.
uh,
So
yeah,
yeah, the through line in all of this is more data needed, which I
yeah,
am sympathetic to and
yep,
don't disagree with.
yep.
So
And
I'm going to close this out with something fun. I
hmm,
saved the crash materials for last.
all right.
Chris Mellon, who we've talked about a lot, good old UFO daddy,
Hmm.
former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, published a new article on Politico called "If the Government Has UFO Crash Materials, Now is the Time to Reveal Them."
Hmm.
Which, fuck yeah, Chris. That is
Yeah.
a great title. I want to read two quick quotes from this. First of all, when he was kind of introducing the article, he said, "I've always believed that the public has a right to know if our government has proof that some UAP are of off world origin. Lately, I have also come to the conclusion that if true, revealing this incredible secret would be very much in the interest of our nation and indeed humanity itself." Now,
Sure.
in the article, he does a little bit of introduction to the topic. Why do we take this seriously? And then he talks about all the work he has done with Congress, like getting whistleblowers in there, helping to draft language to get this out in the open. But he said, part of me has wondered, is this a good idea? Like, am I cracking open Pandora's box?
Hmm.
Am I
Yeah.
encouraging us to share something that could be harmful to society? And the rest of the article is basically him coming to the conclusion that no, like
No, it'll be okay.
this may cause some issues,
Hmm.
yes, but unquestionably having it out is better for us than having it secret. Um, the article's great. You should read it. But there's one quote in here that I want to read that kind of ties back into the idea of whistleblowers with advanced knowledge. He says, "Since AARO was established, I have referred 4 witnesses to them who claim to have knowledge of a secret U.S. government program involving the analysis and exploitation of materials recovered from off-world craft. Other sources who, rightly or wrongly, do not trust AARO's leadership have also contacted me with additional details and information about an alleged secret U.S. government reverse engineering program. Some have supplied information to the intelligence community's inspector general, others directly to staff of the congressional oversight committees. And as this process has progressed and the credibility of these claims has grown, so too have my concerns."
Hmm.
Now, we talked about, George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell earlier talking about whistleblowers with knowledge of
Yeah.
insiders. And, we talked about how Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp are a little bit controversial. I've told you before, UFO Daddy, Chris Mellon, I trust this guy. I trust
Yeah.
him implicitly. He takes this topic the most seriously. He seems to be the most level-headed. Like in any given conversation, he always strikes me as the one adult in the room. And this is him saying, no holds barred, I have spoken to multiple people who are in the crash retrieval section, who know this exists, know where it is. Just like Jeremy was saying, they know
Yeah.
where the bodies are buried, they know where the ships are, they know the names of the program, and they have testified to this effect.
Yeah.
And here's Chris coming out and saying, if you've got crashed materials, now's the time to share them. And in the article, he makes the point, disclosure is happening whether you're ready or not. Now's the time to get in front of it. Um, so yeah, man, I don't know. We keep talking about a lot of smoke. Maybe there's a fire here.
All right.
It sure
So,
feels like we're heading in a direction.
yeah. Okay. So time for theorizing section. We need a catchy word for this, but if
Mhm.
you were the head of one of these programs, would you have been convinced by his article? Would you be like, all right, it's time. We got to start working on declassifying this. Or would you still be feeling like,
I will admit I would not have been convinced, but
okay,
not because it wasn't a persuasive article, but because anybody who is in that position is already well aware of everything Chris says.
well, sure,
Right?
yeah,
Like
okay.
there's no way somebody's running a crash retrieval program and is like, oh, I hadn't considered. Maybe we should let the public know. That thought had never occurred to me. Like
So
these people
there's
have
nothing
thought about it.
in the article that sets up like why now is the right time so much, like, or why being the first to admit would be advantageous.
Well, I I think Chris does a good case of laying out kind of the moral and ethical high ground case for reveal.
Which, something that
But I don't
CEOs
think
care
those are
deeply about.
exactly, yeah. I don't think that if I was, the one guy at Lockheed who knows that we've got UFOs in
Yeah,
Warehouse 7 and 12 people who are aware of it and working on it, like if I'm that guy, I'm already well aware of the costs and consequences. And the thing Chris doesn't talk about is the other thing we've been dancing around for a while, which is if any of this is true, laws have been broken. Like
yeah,
there are legal consequences at risk here. The very like most minor of these is government contractors are supposed to be given the opportunity to bid. And if this happened,
mhm,
this was not a public bidding process. They gave it to someone. So
sure,
if, for example, Lockheed was given access to the crash materials, and for instance, Boeing was not, if I was Boeing, I'd be bringing a lawsuit saying,
sure.
you set my company at a disadvantage.
I
Um,
mean, yeah, but they're constantly being sued. I don't think that's, uh, yeah,
I just mean that like if I'm running one of these programs, my concern might be less about the good of humanity and more
yeah,
about am I personally going to end up in prison? Am I personally going to be facing consequences?
right,
Not to mention the abstract thoughts of if it's giving your company an advantage right now while it's secret, why would you ever want the secret to come out?
right.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
I,
I to get back to your original question, no, I don't think I would find the article compelling. Not
yeah,
because it isn't a compelling article, but because there are a lot of other factors that Chris doesn't talk about. In the case of laying out the moral high ground argument, he is ignoring the real world complications of if you have been actively participating in a criminal conspiracy, you've already made a decision, you know?
yeah. So I heard a quote earlier today, which I'm sure everyone has heard, but it felt nice, felt good today, which was um, change happens when the cost of staying the same is
Yeah,
greater than the cost of change. And
absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
wonder how we make it too expensive to stay,
Mhm.
um, to maintain the current state. Um,
Yeah, I agree. And there is an idea that has been floated around for a number of years that at first I was a little resistant to, but I've since come around to. Leslie Kane talks about this a lot. Like, if illegal stuff has been happening, and the most minor level of illegal stuff is what we're talking about here, like illegal competition between companies. But at the most extreme levels, we're talking about silencing, intimidating, perhaps killing witnesses, defrauding Congress, all sorts of stuff, like potentially really serious criminal charges.
yeah,
Um, you would be insane to voluntarily come forward.
yeah,
And she suggested that what we probably need is something like what happened in South Africa when they got rid of the
apartheid.
segregation policies there. they had a truth and reconciliation
Mm.
platform. And that was, you are allowed to come testify in exchange for immunity.
There you go. Yeah.
If we ever want the truth about the past to come out, I think it's going to have to come with some sort of qualified immunity.
Yeah.
Something where we go, okay, we may not agree in the light of the modern day with the actions you took, but we accept that you did them in what at the time you viewed through the light of national security and best practices. And we're done with that
Whatever.
now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you come forward and testify and tell us what happened, you will face no consequences. I kind of feel like we need that. If
Yeah.
not, I think the most likely way this looks is it does come out, but we never find out the truth about Roswell. We never find out the truth about any of these big events from the past. It'll just remain clouded and lost in history
Cool.
because either the people involved got too old and died,
Yeah.
or those who still know the truth are unwilling to talk about them because they
Right.
might still face consequences.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and because I'm more interested in the truth than I am in punishing someone who did something that I feel is morally wrong,
Right.
I'm on board with this idea of like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah. An amnesty program. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
I feel like we should make it a limited number, like the first three to come out. Uh, and that way
Oh
there's some
shit.
like pressure, you know?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
as soon as
I
that
like that.
second
Yeah.
one comes out, like, whoo, you know, it's just gonna be a lot of people stressing out about this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you get amnesty for a certain number of criminal charges, and it reduces by one for each whistleblower who comes out.
yes, I love this plan. Let's do that.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So I said I wasn't going to mention it, but I will go ahead and mention it. If you've listened this far, you're a diehard member of our audience. Chuck is going on vacation for a few weeks coming up. The way we're going to handle this is we are going to record another episode almost immediately, which will get put in the back pocket and released on schedule in a
Mhm.
couple weeks. And then after that, there will be a 3 week break instead of a 2 week break. So I'll mention this more in the next episode, but hopefully for you, the listener, it will not be too disruptive. The only thing to be aware of is our next episode will be pre-recorded, meaning we will not really be talking about news, which unfortunately there may actually be some news. The rumor is still that the House is about to start holding their
Yeah,
UAP hearings. So
yeah,
probably what's going to happen is we will be back in early July
yeah.
to discuss everything that happened in June.
Well, hey, if you know, if someone comes out and it's like, if capital D disclosure happens, you just call me in Mexico and we'll record it then, okay? Like, yeah, it's gonna be okay.
Noted. Noted. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for listening. This has been a blast. And Chuck, as always, thank you for listening to me talk about UFOs so my wife doesn't have to.